Pirates of the Dirac Sea, Supplemental Chrstmas Special 2019. Fiction by Allex Spires. Read by Allex Spires. America means freedom, and there's no expression of freedom quite like music. Glenn Miller, band leader, conductor, trombonist, music composer, music arranger, Army major, Bronze Star recipient, war revolutionary, world changer. The writer wrote that 75 years ago, December 15, 1944, Glenn Miller disappeared from the face of the planet and that nobody has seen or heard from him since. The story comes in a feedback loop. The writer drew X's and spirals and zigzag scribbles over the previous text, blacking it out, and then wrote that the story comes in a feedback loop and that the needle is a microphone that rides the groove and gets pickup every time it crashes into a bump in the record playing Glenn Miller's In the Mood, and that the more curious of readers would look up Glenn Miller's In the Mood on their preferred audio or video streaming service, app, or site. Maybe even thumbing through a collection of CDs, cassettes, or even phonographic record albums to find it and play it. And every reader who did so would recognize it when it started up and would let it play on to the end. Those who watched videos might be impressed with the dancing brass gymnastics kept up by the current iteration of the Glenn Miller Orchestra, or the way the soundscape is interwoven into cityscapes and landscapes and dreamscapes by some daring video editors. The words cross the mind, and the question hurts to be answered. How could anyone ever forget Glenn Miller? The writer wrote that Buddy DeFranco, who took over the Glenn Miller Orchestra in the 1960s, a veteran of a lifetime in the jazz business, having worked with acts like Tommy Dorsey and Gene Krupa, found that Glenn Miller's music was less boogie-woogie and swing and more a genuine time machine that carried the air of a time before death camps and before atomic bombs and before iron curtains, when there was a childish hope for a brighter tomorrow. Had once said in a radio interview that, when I had the band open with Moonlight Serenade, I could see men and women weeping on the dance floor as the music carried them back to years gone by. The beauty of Glenn Miller's music was not in the music, but in the reactions it caused. It caused people to dance together. The writer wrote that in 1991, jazz critic Gunther Sculler reported, Glenn Miller exuded little warmth on or off the bandstand, but once his band struck up its theme, audiences were done for. Throats clutched, eyes softened to the music. No other tones have ever produced such a Pavlovian slobbering in so many for so long. The sound was able to penetrate our collective unconscious. Another jazz critic, Doug Ramsey, noted in 1997, a disproportionate ratio of nostalgia to substance keeps Miller's music alive today. The writer scribbled X's and spirals and zigzags across the previous page until it was all blacked out, assuming the reader would already be aware of most of what had been written, and decided it was better to unfold through stark dramatic exposition, reminding himself, start the story when the body hits the floor. The writer wrote that 75 years ago, December 15, 1944, Glenn Miller disappeared from the face of the planet and that nobody has seen or heard from him since. The story comes in a feedback loop like a scratched record, repeating a single note forever, over and again. The writer wrote that the needle is a microphone that rides the groove in the phonograph record and that a person, any person of any race, of any faith, of any economic level or social class, anywhere in America who put In the Mood on the gramophone on Christmas morning of 1944, winced at the beloved tune, choked, grimaced, and then scratched the screaming needle off the record, lifted it off the turntable, up the spindle, and smashed it, crying. The writer wrote that the Pirate King stood at the helm of his ship, the Plank, which was listing and taking on water, and as he looked up at the charcoal clouds on that dark and stormy night, he saw a flash of ball lightning that exploded into electric incandescent glow of St. Elmo's fire, and time couldn't move fast enough as he felt it all. The realization that Glenn Miller was gone. He felt the screaming needle cut through his mind as it cut across the record, felt the sharp plastic shards shattering and stabbing into his palms. It was almost too much. He felt dizzy, and his grip slipped, and he nearly fell to the freezing wet deck himself. He came out of his stupor and leaned into the wheel, fighting to keep the rudder straight. The writer wrote that Major General Doolittle had commented that, aside from a letter from home, there is no greater boost to Allied troop morale than Glenn Miller's In the Mood, whether played on a record or on the radio or in person by his band at a live show. Where's Glenn Miller? We go live in 2 hours. Where the hell is he? The writer wrote that the news was kept secret for the sake of troop morale, but at the height of the Ardennes Offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, on Christmas Eve, December 24, 1944, Glenn Miller, whose music uplifted the hearts of all who heard it, was supposed to conduct a special Christmas radio concert in newly liberated Paris. Instead, Edward R. Murrow reported from London that Glenn Miller's plane, a model known for the carburetor icing over, had disappeared in the early morning hours of December 15, 9 days prior, somewhere over the French side of the English Channel. The exact cause of the plane's disappearance was unknown, and he ended his report with his signature line, "Good night, and good luck." Every Allied soldier who heard the news may as well have had a 1-ton blockbuster dropped on their heads. Hearts were broken. The next day, Christmas of 1944, was the saddest Chrstmas ever recorded for the USA. Across the country, people scratched the needle off In the Mood. Nobody was in the mood for In the Mood anymore. War had taken America's most beloved son, everybody's buddy, who knew just how to tickle everyone's ear just right, whose music uplifted the hearts of all who heard it, who had taken not bombs or guns, but jazz music into battle as his weapon of choice. On December 15, 1944, Glenn Miller's plane disappeared. No sign of it has ever been reported. And when it was announced on that Christmas Eve, the music died. The writer wrote that now it was personal. Life needs time for what it lives to die for, as death needs time for what it kills to live for. Death is what kills to live, and life is what lives to die. Death kills and life lives. Death lives and life dies. Life is death. Death never dies. Everything will end. All expires. The writer wrote that in December of 1994, a young jazz fan found In the Mood on a jukebox in a little bar. He put it on, his toes tapped, he started to dance. An old man facing away at the bar looked into the mirror at the happy-go-lucky youth and asked him to change the song. That music shouldn't play. That's Glenn Miller. The young jazz fan danced toward the old man and said, "Don't you know Glenn Miller? How could anyone ever forget Glenn Miller?" The writer wrote that the old man turned to show the young man a sagging frown with a quavering, stubbly jaw and hazel eyes, reddened and drooping, wet with ready tears. "That music used to make me smile. Now it makes me cry. I'll never forget. The music always makes me remember. 50 years ago, the sadness of that Christmas day was devastating and soul-destroying. What we did, oh God, what we did." "What Christmas day?" The young man danced. "Who do you mean by we? What are you talking about?" "A long, long time ago." The old man looked into the middle distance as the music played on and carried him back across the years, and gradually, in his own well-crafted style, he told the story that preceded this dialogue as well as what unfolds in the content that follows. The writer drew X's and spirals across the previous pages and scribbled on until they were completely blacked out, turned to a new page, smoothed it, and wrote that Glenn Miller's music was less boogie-woogie and swing and more a genuine time machine, and that at the end of 1944, across the 48 states, the jazz era's golden age dried up. The old familiar tunes and their humanizing, unifying, liberating values faded away. The writer wrote that Glenn Miller's plane disappeared somewhere over the French side of the English Channel 10 days before Christmas, 1944. That year's Christmas Eve, when the announcement of Miller's death was directly transmitted from London and retransmitted from station to station and from ship to shore over shortwave radio across the Atlantic to the USA and across Europe and around the world. That was the day when America lost her innocence. Now it was personal for every living, breathing, red-blooded American. There'd be no more pussyfooting around about sportsmanlike behavior, as a life-death struggle on a global scale would be lost by the most polite and could only be won by the fiercest force. The writer wrote that at 5:30 a.m., July 25, 1945, J. Robert Oppenheimer said, "I have become Shiva, destroyer of worlds." The writer wrote that the old man told about how the public reaction to the disappearance of Glenn Miller is the cultural subtext that allowed J. Robert Oppenheimer, albeit to his friends, so I never call him that, to become Shiva, destroyer of worlds, as, just a scant 2 months after Miller disappeared, on February 11, 1945, the The United States Congress was shown footage of nuclear bomb research and animations of predicted explosions with cute three-dimensionally designed diagrams comparing blast radii. This was the big boy weapon. Crack-a-doom! When the film stopped and the lights were brought up, Oppenheimer, who was seated, sharing his report on nuclear bomb tests and his determinations on how best to use the bomb for the war effort, spoke neatly into a microphone and faced the U.S. Congress. "In 2 days," said J. Robert Oppenheimer, rolling his thick eyebrows above his long, flat, twitching nose, "a German city of almost no strategic value called Dresden is to be attacked by the Allied forces intending to stop the major train lines that pass through there. This city has never been attacked throughout the whole course of the war. It represents German validity, culture, history, art, science, humanity, progress, everything they took from us when they shot down Miller. Military morale is now simply a drive to defend him. If we can destroy this city, we can feel that we got even. It may be an incredible boost of morale, of inestimable proportions." Oppenheimer stretched his slender neck, looking around at the united congressional delegation of every state representative. "Also, if we can drop as much ordnance as we can possibly spare in a joint effort with the Allied forces to be ready within 2 days, we can have a comparative test on a live target with living subjects against the weapons we have known," he said, and then he pointed to the blank white projector screen, continuing, "and the super bomb you have just seen described. When we drop this thing on Berlin, we can know just how effective it is compared to standard weapons by direct comparison against the damage at Dresden. It's the only way we can be sure of just how truly effective it is, and I want to add, on a personal note, I do want to get back at them for shooting down Glenn Miller. I am really in the mood for this." The writer wrote that the U.S. Congress introduced a measure and voted unanimously for the use of the World War's battlefield as a proving ground for atomic bomb tests on living human subjects. February 12, 1945 was emotionally the coldest of coldest mornings ever recorded in America. Lincoln's birthday, national holiday. Newspapers carried headlines about authorization to use the new super bomb against authoritarianism. A government-authorized story about Glenn Miller's value to American morale accompanied every headline about the bomb printed anywhere in the country, included the quote from Major General Doolittle, who had commented that, aside from a letter from home, there is no greater boost to Allied troop morale than Glenn Miller's "In the Mood," whether played on a record or on the radio or in person by his band at a live show. The writer wrote that at 5:30 a.m., July 25, 1945, J. Robert Oppenheimer said, "I have become Shiva, destroyer of worlds." The writer wrote that when the little boy blew up, it shook the world in more ways than one. The earth itself did shudder, and the very foundations of the morals that dictate the value of human life itself were ruptured. On August 6, 1945, with congressional authorization for use on the battlefield, the Enola Gay dropped the little boy at Hiroshima. Crack-a-doom! Buildings exploded, radiation burned, fire blasted through every street. 140,000 men, women, and children were killed instantly, dissolved fast as light, their ashes blasted into radiographic prints of their own shadows. 1 million more with injuries, concussions, shrapnel impacts, burns, mutations, lost limbs, radiation sickness. Said J. Robert Oppenheimer, "Thank the Holy Trinity that it wasn't a dud." Would have been better if we all died. The old man turned back to his drink, shuddering. The young jazz fan walked out of the bar. A frown creased his brow. The writer scribbled X's and zigzags and spirals all over the previous text, wiping it out until the whole pages were completely blackened, turned to a fresh page, and wrote that the Pirate King, his tri-corner hat tugged down over a tight bandana, wore waders and a pea-coat tightly sashed at the waist, and that he stood at the helm on the deck of his ship, the Plank, which was listing and taking on water as it scaled a massive wave, being pummeled by cross-currents, typhoon rains, and ocean spray blasted at him with the force of a fire hose, seemingly from all sides. stinging his numbed hands and face, soaking through his protective clothing, and he gripped the ship's wheel as solidly as he could, all sails furled and tied away. Just the force of the choppy waters under the dense charcoal clouds on that dark and stormy night directed against the rudder drove the ship onward, and as the Pirate King looked to the coarse, distorted, dim sky, he saw a flash of ball lightning, and then it exploded into sheet lightning, and the electric incandescence of St. Elmo's fire filled his whole visual field like an atomic bomb cataract, and the Pirate King felt everything. He felt the shame of being among the Allied forces at that time, of changing into a monster and knowing there was no going back. He felt the heat of the bomb and himself being torn apart from his body, his every cell broken into molecules, molecules broken into atoms, atoms broken into radicals and ions, burned to nothing and blasted as ash into a line of 40 others blown back and smashed into a shadowy phantasmagoria pressed into a brick wall, becoming an ash shadow. He felt his limbs cut off by flying molten metal, dissolved off by gamma radiation, magnified through lenses of molten glass, bleeding into the exploding roadways. He felt the mutations and the pain of unnecessary new body functions, warping his physical structure and inducing suicidal fantasies to escape the pain of experiencing sensation. He felt the radiation sickness work through the atoms that made up his body and mutate his microbiome to eat himself from the inside. He felt his skin melt to his musculature, and his irradiated skeleton cooked his body from the inside, and his brain became dead cooked meat. He felt it all, and held fast the wheel, sneering at the sky and coughing what tasted like spoiled blood pudding. The writer wrote that on November 3, 2019, as part of a retrospective on the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the BBC released a new interview with Mikhail Gorbachev wherein, with a distant look of frozen fear, he spoke about the danger of nuclear world war. As long as weapons of mass destruction exist, primarily nuclear weapons, the danger is dreadfully immense, irrespective of any political or governmental decisions, just by their being in existence. Gorbachev shook his head, the strawberry mark on his forehead waving side to side like a train crossing flashing red light. Just look at how many vicious people there are today who go around blowing things up. The encroaching fear shaded his eyes. They might seize control of these nuclear weapons. He shook his head again, shuddering as though a deep chill had just washed over him. If these weapons are fired, it will induce retaliation. He beseeched the viewers. This cannot be allowed to happen. Listen, all nations must declare that all nuclear weapons must be destroyed. This is to save ourselves and our planet. The writer wrote that the reader was dragged along at whiplash breakneck, white-knuckle eye-burning speed as the whale hauled the reader on through the infinite deeps of the Dirac Sea. The writer came alongside the reader and asked, "Do you ever wonder why humans can't use 100% of their brains?" Yeah, that's the key to telepathy in higher dimensions. Well, it turns out that if a human uses more than 15% of their brains at a given time, it causes a processing overload and induces a seizure. We can't process that much because we are the individual in the now. We cannot be more than one instance of activity. As Einstein put it, there is no simultaneity within a given system. The writer wrote that the reader was dragged on, but the writer disappeared from view, and only the voice of the writer could be heard echoing in the back of the mind, as though remembered, but new. Initiate operation total seizure. The writer wrote that the hyperdimensional being sat on a raft on a ball of water in which was projected the whole universe in present time. The being stood up, and an arm raised to the sky. In the hand at the arm's end was a flare gun which fired off a single flare which exploded across the galaxy-strewn sky, which reflected inside the ball of water across the whole internally projected universe, across all their skies. It went off like an SOS from the universe to itself. "Hang up the phone!" But it had to answer to get the message not to answer. Everything started happening all at once. The writer wrote that 6 hours before the sun would rise over America's east coast on Christmas morning 1944, it rose over Europe, where the Ardennes Offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, carried on under grueling conditions in the most frigid temperatures many fighting had ever faced in one of the coldest winters ever recorded. with overnight temperatures approaching 40 below zero. Cannon fire and gunfire and explosions and shouts and screams and grinding of diesel engines echoed through the wilderness across which the Allied troops were making their way against a tank blockade toward Berlin. In that wilderness, 2 men who hadn't eaten in a day carried a third who was wounded and hadn't eaten since last night, trying to find the front lines as they'd been separated from their unit several days prior due to the injuries of the third man. All 3 were Americans, and none knew how to find their way. A thin veneer of clouds, dense as ice, hove above the land, distorting the source of the dim sunlight by which they traveled. They still had a happy-go-lucky attitude because, of course, they hadn't heard about Glenn Miller. "Look!" One pointed above the treetops at the peak of the roof of the cabin. The 3 made their way. Inside the cabin, a woman and her 10-year-old son were preparing for the return of the boy's father. Worriedly anticipating widowhood, the war sounding within hundreds of yards, the mother was relieved to hear a knocking at the door, sure it must be her husband. At the door were 2 men with rifles and backpacks in thick woolen overcoats, scarves, and rounded helmets. A third was lying on the ground. Frightened at first, recognizing the enemy, but then realizing these armed men could just rush in and lay siege to the cabin if they really wanted to, the woman gestured, inviting them in. She got blankets and put the injured one in a bed and wrapped him up. She made porridge and served coffee, and her son built up the fire. None of the American soldiers knew German, and the woman and her son didn't speak English, but they found that they all spoke a little bit of French, and that was plenty to get by on. The writer wrote that a few hours after the Americans had arrived, another knock came at the door. The woman answered and found 4 German soldiers who wondered if they could count on her hospitality on this Christmas day, as they had become separated from their unit and needed to reorient themselves to get back to where they were supposed to be. She came outside and told them she already had guests, but she didn't think they would get along. Amerikaners? Ja. The writer wrote that she told the Germans that it was Christmas Day and she would not tolerate violence in her home, especially on that day. She and her family had moved away from the city to get away from the fighting, and now it was outside in the valley. They could hear the cannon fire and the gunfire, explosions, screams, the grinding of diesel engines, all echoing through the wilderness as the Allies made their way against a blockade of tanks toward Berlin. She would not tolerate it inside her home. The Germans agreed that if the Americans would disarm, they would also disarm if it meant they could get in from the cold and sit by a fire and have a meal. She left them outside and came and told the 2 Americans in the sitting room who it was at the door, and that she would not tolerate violence in her home on this holy day. The Americans agreed to give up their arms only if, when the Germans came in, they were unarmed. The woman told her son to stand between the Americans by the fire and the front door. The writer wrote that she let the Germans come inside. They were all barehanded. Their sidearms and rifles were set outside the door. The young son collected the Americans' guns and took them outside, putting them on the opposite side of the door from where the Germans had laid their own arms. "You are all Americans. It's a miracle you speak English. We have barely been able to communicate." I have an even greater surprise. The German who spoke English took a satchel off his shoulder. He reached inside. Everyone froze. All eyes went to the hand in the bag. Eternity seemed to go by. A ticking sound turned into a squeal as the German who spoke English started to laugh. He pulled out a bottle of 20-year-old Merlot and a baguette. He set his Christmas offerings on the table. "The Frau says you have an injured friend. I have some medical training, so if I can look at him, please." "Yes, he's in the bedroom." "Can you tell me her name?" The writer wrote that the woman slaughtered a chicken, and they all plucked its feathers, and with everybody throwing in, it was ready to roast in no time. The injured soldier seemed like he would heal all right, but he needed rest and food. By the time dinner came around, he was already sitting by the fire, eating oatmeal to build up his strength. The Americans gave the Germans a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes. The Germans hadn't had real tobacco since D-Day, and the Germans gave the Americans a compass. After the meal, the 2 groups went outside and collected their weapons. The Germans went east, and the Americans went west. And as soon as they were out of each other's sight, the truce was ended. The writer wrote that an hour later, the woman's husband came home, hungry. The writer wrote that being with hate is an irrational and self-defeating way to observe the world, and that war is stupid. truly is stupid and unreasoned. And because war is stupid, in this story, the Pacific theater of World War II was stupidly fought over how to play baseball. Japan had Yaku baseball and America had Doubleday baseball. Both originated from Cartwright's Knickerbocker Rules of Baseball of 1845. Though the games shared a common origin, their rules had deviated sharply to differ across the widest ocean over the interceding century. The bombing of Pearl Harbor, a strike against the final resting place of the inventor of their own national sport, was performed out of consternation over inability to agree on special international rules to define a genuine World Series of baseball. Despite the Baseball World Cup being open for entrance from any place on the globe since 1938, and despite baseball being Japan's national sport, Japan was not able to participate in the Baseball World Cup because the size of the ball and the size of the field was different in each sport. Doubleday baseball has 90-foot baselines, while Yaku baseball has 80-foot baselines, and in Doubleday baseball the ball is 3 inches in diameter, and in Yaku baseball the ball is 2.75 inches. The writer wrote that Japan wanted to split the difference and go with a 2.85-inch ball and 85-foot baselines. America would only play according to American rules, no special international rules, so Japan was insulted. They would have to retrain all their players to play their national sport differently from their traditional style just to please these others, and insisted on a compromise. America refused to compromise. This stupidity is what the Pacific theater of World War II was all about. What all war is really all about. Whose rules are better to live and play by. The writer wrote that they cannot unite, not that they cannot untie, that they cannot unite. The Gordian knot split in two, that they cannot unite. Doubleday is not Yaku. Yaku is not Doubleday, not that they cannot retie. Kaboom boom boom stay true. World War II. The end of the supplemental Christmas special.